You are so brave. I wish my generals were as brave as you. You all made history, and you are the real hero.
Rochus Misch stood closer to Adolf Hitler than almost anyone, watching, listening, guarding. As his bodyguard and telephonist, Misch witnessed the dictator not only as a leader, but as a man. Unpredictable, charming, ruthless, and at times disturbingly ordinary.
I was just a young soldier, Hitler's bodyguard, not a politician. I saw everything and survived.
Now, his account peels back the layers of myth and manipulation to expose a Hitler the world has never truly seen.
The last witness to Adolf Hitler's final hours has himself died.
From secret conversations in the Reich Chancellery to quiet moments in the bunker, Misch's revelations are stunning. This isn't just a look at the monster of history, it's a chilling portrait of the man behind the madness. Entering the Führer's service. Rochus Misch's path into the inner circle of Adolf Hitler's regime was shaped less by ideology than by circumstance. Born in 1917 in what was then Silesia, Misch lost both his parents at an early age and was raised by his grandparents. Like many young men in Germany during the 1930s, he was swept up in the wave of nationalism and joined the SS, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, in 1937. Initially, it was a decision driven more by a desire for security and belonging than by deep political conviction. The SS, for young recruits like Misch, offered a stable future, regular pay, and a sense of identity at a time when Germany was still reeling from the economic collapse of the Weimar Republic and the bitterness of World War I's aftermath. His fortunes changed quickly. In 1938, Misch was selected to join the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, an elite unit originally formed to serve as Hitler's personal bodyguard. This was no ordinary assignment. The Leibstandarte operated at the highest levels of Nazi command and included only men deemed absolutely loyal to the Führer. Admission required rigorous physical conditioning, unshakable obedience, and unwavering allegiance to the Nazi cause, or at the very least, the ability to convincingly demonstrate those traits. The unit accompanied Hitler during public events, guarded him during private meetings, and maintained an almost constant presence around the top leadership of the Third Reich. By 1940, at just 23 years old, Misch had been pulled into the very core of Hitler's personal security detail, a role that would put him in close contact with one of history's most infamous figures. He eventually became one of only a handful of individuals permitted to move freely within the Führer's various headquarters. As Hitler's bodyguard, courier, and eventually his communications officer, Misch was not just a witness to the regime's final days, he was embedded within its inner sanctum. That close proximity to Hitler would define Misch's entire life, and eventually, his legacy. Day to day, inside Hitler's circle. Rochus Misch was no ordinary personal bodyguard. He worked at the very heart of the Nazi regime, stationed in the private rooms and fortified bunkers, where major decisions of World War II were made. His duties went far beyond standing guard. Misch was responsible for maintaining Hitler's private communication systems, securing telephone lines, relaying critical military messages, and operating encrypted radio and telex equipment. His role gave him unique access to some of the most sensitive and secretive aspects of the Nazi war machine. From 1940 until the collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, Misch was present at nearly every one of Hitler's military headquarters. He served at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, and most notably, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Hitler's main Eastern Front command post. It was there, in July 1944, that he narrowly survived the failed assassination attempt by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, one of the most famous plots against Hitler. Misch witnessed the chaos that followed the explosion and the tightening of Hitler's inner circle in its aftermath. Despite the brutal and far-reaching consequences of the regime he served, Misch insisted after the war that he had no knowledge of the atrocities being carried out across occupied Europe. He claimed he was simply a loyal soldier following orders, unaware of the Holocaust or the inner workings of Nazi extermination policies. Yet his proximity to power cast serious doubt on those claims. Misch was often the first point of contact for breaking reports from the front lines and sat just outside rooms where high-level strategy meetings took place. Meetings attended by figures like Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Hermann Göring, and Albert Speer. He watched these men come and go, sometimes in panic, sometimes with icy composure, as the tide of war began to turn against Germany. And as Germany spiraled into collapse, that position of silent witness became far more dangerous and complicated. Inside the bunker in Hitler's final days, In April 1945, the once mighty Nazi regime was on the verge of total collapse. Berlin, the heart of Hitler's empire, was being squeezed from all sides as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly through the city's outer districts. The war in Europe was all but lost, and the German military was in full retreat. Amid the chaos and destruction, Adolf Hitler made the decision to withdraw from public view and take refuge deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in the Führer bunker, a heavily fortified underground complex designed to serve as both a shelter and command center in times of extreme crisis. Among those who accompanied Hitler into this subterranean last stand was Rochus Misch. When the order came to move operations underground, Misch followed, unaware that he was walking into what would become one of the most historically infamous death scenes in modern history. Once sealed inside the bunker, conditions quickly turned grim. The atmosphere was tense, oppressive, and increasingly paranoid. Hitler, now a shell of the man who had once commanded armies across Europe, spent his final weeks issuing delusional orders and obsessing over perceived betrayals. He refused to acknowledge the full extent of Germany's defeat, choosing instead to believe that internal treachery, rather than Allied military superiority, was to blame for the collapse. Rochus Misch remained at his post throughout this psychological unraveling, maintaining the bunker's critical communication systems. But as Soviet artillery grew louder by the hour, and reports from the battlefield turned increasingly hopeless, even routine tasks began to feel surreal. The war outside was ending in fire and rubble, but inside the bunker, the Nazi elite clung to their illusions of control, even as their world collapsed around them. By late April, most of the city's defenders were either dead, captured, or in full retreat. Berlin had become a battlefield of desperation, and the bunker itself was now more prison than fortress. Inside, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, remained fiercely loyal. So did Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary. Not for 1 second did Misch think of abandoning the Führer. But even their determination couldn't mask the truth. The Third Reich was finished. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide inside the Führer bunker.
The underground bunker where Adolf Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945.
Eva took cyanide. Hitler, according to most accounts, shot himself in the head. Rochus Misch was just a few rooms away when it happened. Shortly afterward, Misch saw the bodies wrapped in blankets and carried past him, up the stairs to the garden of the Chancellery. There, in accordance with Hitler's explicit instructions, the corpses were placed in a shallow shell crater, drenched in gasoline, and set on fire. The goal was to prevent the Soviet army from capturing the remains and turning them into a gruesome war trophy. Misch remained underground for another 3 days after Hitler's death. By then, the bunker was eerily quiet, filled with a mix of fear, despair, and resignation. Food was scarce, ammunition was running out, and above all, they knew the Soviets were closing in. Finally, with no options left and Soviet troops approaching the bunker's outer defenses, Rochus Misch decided to flee. But his escape into Soviet hands was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of nearly a decade in captivity and a lifetime of silence. 9 years of interrogation and isolation. After emerging from the safety of the bunker, where he had spent the final days of the Third Reich, Rochus Misch was quickly taken into custody by advancing Soviet forces. Given his position as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard and telephone operator, Misch was considered a prisoner of significant interest. Soviet military intelligence viewed him as someone with first-hand knowledge of Hitler's behavior, inner circle, and potentially even undisclosed wartime plans. Because of this, Misch was subjected to relentless interrogation. For the next 9 years, he was shuffled between various Soviet labor camps and high-security prisons. The conditions were brutal: harsh winters, forced labor, little food, and minimal contact with the outside world. Interrogations were frequent and exhaustive. Soviet officials wanted to know everything: Hitler's psychological state during the final days of the war, the bunker's routines, the actions and conversations of other key Nazi figures, and any secrets that might have remained hidden as the Reich collapsed. Misch answered what he could, but often claimed to know little beyond what was directly in front of him. In 1954, nearly a decade after his capture, Misch was unexpectedly released. He returned to a changed West Berlin, a city now split by Cold War tensions. Despite the political upheaval and the lasting trauma of his imprisonment, Misch quietly reintegrated into civilian life. He opened a small shop and chose to live in the same neighborhood where he had once grown up, as if trying to reclaim a piece of the life he had before the war. For many years, he remained out of the spotlight. Unlike some other former Nazis who either faced prosecution or escaped into exile, Misch stayed put. He kept a low profile, avoided interviews, and rarely spoke in detail about what he had seen or experienced during the war. Some believed he escaped prosecution simply because he had held no rank of authority or made any major decisions. Others thought it was because he had been tight-lipped, revealing very little during his interrogations and maintaining that silence long after. In the years that followed, Misch became something of an enigma, a man who had stood beside one of history's most infamous dictators, yet managed to disappear into the background. His story, for a long time, remained mostly untold, but what he chose to say was just as telling as what he chose to leave out. The man who wouldn't betray the boss. In the early 2000s, Rochus Misch suddenly stepped back into the spotlight. As the last surviving member of Adolf Hitler's inner circle, Misch began granting interviews, appearing in documentaries, and eventually published a memoir titled The Last Witness.
The last witness to Adolf Hitler's final hours has himself died.
To many, his re-emergence was a chance to hear firsthand what it had been like inside Hitler's bunker during the final days of the Third Reich. But what truly shocked people wasn't just what he remembered, it was how he chose to talk about it. Far from showing remorse or acknowledging any sense of guilt, Misch spoke of his time with Hitler in strangely warm, even nostalgic terms. He insisted he had simply been doing his job, nothing more, nothing less. In a 2005 interview with the Associated Press, Misch was asked the obvious question, had Hitler ever mentioned the Holocaust? His answer was blunt and unsettling. That was never a topic, never. He made no attempt to deny the existence of the Holocaust, but he distanced himself from it entirely, claiming he had never heard Hitler speak about it. 4 years later, in a 2009 interview with the BBC, Misch elaborated slightly. He admitted knowing that concentration camps existed. He even named Dachau the first Nazi concentration camp, established in 1933. But again, he maintained that he had no real understanding of the scale or horror of what was happening inside them. According to him, I knew about Dachau camp and about concentration camps in general, but I had no idea of the scale. It wasn't part of our conversations. When pressed on whether he felt any regret about having served Hitler so closely, both as a bodyguard and as a member of his personal communications staff, Misch offered a response that stunned many listeners. He was a wonderful boss. I lived with him for 5 years. We were the closest people who worked with him. We were always there. Hitler was never without us day and night. This unflinching loyalty wasn't just something Misch expressed in passing interviews. It was the core of his memoir, The Last Witness. Throughout the book, he painted a picture of himself as a loyal servant who simply followed orders and kept out of politics. He offered behind-the-scenes glimpses into Hitler's daily routine, but consistently avoided engaging with the deeper moral questions surrounding the Nazi regime. He never acknowledged complicity. He never reflected on whether being that close to power came with responsibility. Instead, he framed the years spent in Hitler's inner circle as a kind of strange office job. In the foreword to the English language edition, he even wrote that it had all been a different reality, and that his experience had been little more than a regular day at work. To some, especially in Germany and parts of Eastern Europe, Misch was viewed as a relic of a dangerous past. He was seen as a man who had witnessed unspeakable history but chose to look the other way. His defenders, however, described him as a soldier trapped by circumstance, a young man pulled into events far beyond his control who had simply followed orders and survived. But critics argued that this explanation was not only insufficient, it was dangerous. They accused Misch of hiding behind his loyalty to Hitler as a way to avoid taking responsibility for his role, however minor, in a criminal regime. By presenting Hitler as a wonderful boss and portraying himself as apolitical, Misch seemed to sidestep the broader moral reckoning that had come for so many others after the war. And then, not long after these interviews and the publication of his book, the inevitable happened. The end of a loyal soldier. Rochus Misch died on September 5, 2013, at the age of 96. His death represented more than the passing of an individual. It marked the end of a direct, living connection to one of the darkest and most infamous chapters in modern human history. When Misch passed away, there were no dramatic final words spoken to the public. There was no confession of guilt, no heartfelt apology, and no visible attempt at seeking redemption for his role in the Nazi regime. In death, as in life, Misch maintained a position of staunch loyalty and silence regarding the regime he had once served so closely. For many historians, researchers, and observers of World War II and Holocaust history, Misch's passing symbolized a closing door, a final, irreversible severance from a first-hand witness to events that shaped the 20th century in the most tragic of ways. With no public disclosure or intimate revelations, Misch was widely regarded as a man who had taken his secrets, his experiences, and perhaps his true thoughts, with him to the grave. That assumption held for more than a decade, until a letter unexpectedly came to light, and it has left the world stunned. The letter that changed everything. In early 2025, construction workers carrying out routine repairs in a long-abandoned apartment made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the historical community. The apartment had reportedly once been occupied by Rochus Misch. As workers pulled away a section of insulation inside one of the walls, they uncovered a hidden metal container. Airtight and securely sealed, the box appeared untouched for years. Inside, they found a folded, yellowed envelope, aged by time but perfectly preserved. It was handwritten, in German, and dated late 2012, just a few months before Misch's death. The letter was signed in full, Rochus Misch. Its opening line was brief and ominous: "I can't keep silent anymore." A document that contradicted everything Misch had claimed publicly for decades. The letter described events he had witnessed while serving in Hitler's inner circle. Many of them, according to him, had tormented him for years. Misch admitted that he had lied to protect himself. In public, he had always insisted he knew nothing of the regime's worst crimes. But in private, as revealed in this final letter, the truth was far more horrifying. He wrote about political enemies and suspected traitors being buried alive, often in remote forested areas. He claimed the executions were carried out without mercy or trial. According to the letter, Hitler himself sometimes watched the killings from behind protective glass. Misch recalled one moment in chilling detail, victims clawing at the dirt, screaming, while Hitler looked on calmly. He smiled and said, "Justice sleeps best underground." Misch also described poison experiments on prisoners, carried out at Hitler's request. He said that Hitler not only observed the experiments, but took notes and insisted on timed trials. The tests were repeated, with different variations, while the prisoners were left to suffer. Misch stated that he was present for some of these experiments, though he claimed he did not participate directly. The most disturbing part of the letter involved the death of a young girl, reportedly gifted to Hitler by a high-ranking officer as a sign of loyalty and devotion. A few days later, the girl was found dead in the woods near the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat. The official report at the time labeled it an enemy ambush. But Misch wrote that he always believed Hitler had ordered her murder, perhaps to eliminate a potential liability. He said the incident was carefully covered up in internal SS files. Throughout the letter, Misch returned to the personal toll these events had taken on him. He wrote of being haunted by nightmares, unable to sleep for nights at a time. "I see their faces at night," he wrote. "I hear their voices under the ground." Misch said he had carried this guilt for decades, locked away in silence. He had told himself he was just a guard, a bystander, but as he aged, the memories became heavier and harder to bear. The letter suggests he could no longer reconcile the things he had witnessed with the image he had tried to present to the world. He ended the letter with a stark admission: "I lied to protect myself, but silence is a form of guilt. Let the truth now be known, even if it comes too late." Experts who examined the container and the letter believe it was deliberately hidden in a way that would ensure it remained undiscovered until long after Misch's death. The method of preservation, an airtight seal, insulation, and careful concealment, suggests that Misch wanted the truth to emerge, but only when he was no longer alive to answer for it. What began as a letter in an attic has now become a moral earthquake, one that has forced a re-examination of the last living witness to Hitler's regime. The world grapples with Misch's final words. Although no official statement has yet been made about what the document contains, several sources familiar with its handling have confirmed that serious conversations are now taking place at both federal and state archival institutions. These discussions reportedly focus on three key areas: authenticating the document, accurately translating its contents, and deciding whether or not to release it to the public. The process is expected to be complex and closely watched. Meanwhile, survivors of the Nazi regime, as well as Holocaust education advocates, have quietly called for complete transparency. They argue that the letter, if verified, could provide critical new insight into Adolf Hitler's behavior and the inner workings of the Third Reich's leadership. According to some experts, the descriptions within the letter could even lead to the discovery of long-hidden documents or unknown individuals who may have witnessed key events. Not everyone agrees on how to proceed. Some historians and analysts have allegedly advised caution, warning that rushing to conclusions without full verification could cause more harm than good. At the same time, a small but vocal group of critics has raised doubts about the circumstances of the letter's discovery. They question the motives of the construction workers who reportedly found the document, suggesting they may be seeking publicity or financial gain. However, the leader of the crew has denied these accusations, stating that the team handed over the letter immediately to the authorities and never intended to attract media attention. Despite these assurances, suspicion continues to linger in some circles. Amid the ongoing debate, several independent sources with access to the investigation have stated privately that the letter is almost certainly authentic. One source, who has reportedly reviewed key portions of the letter, said, "It aligns too perfectly with facts Misch could not have known unless he was there and unless he was truly listening." For now, the public is currently abuzz, stunned by the letter that has slowly begun to surface online. Many are eagerly awaiting the full release of the letter, which is expected to provide more insight into its contents. But one thing is certain: the man who spent his life denying responsibility, defending Hitler, and claiming ignorance of the crimes around him may have saved the most horrifying truths for a time when he could no longer be held accountable. And in doing so, Rochus Misch may have finally admitted, in death, the guilt he could never face in life. What do you think about Misch's letter? Feel free to share your comments with us in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.